I'm Jack Soultanian, and I'm one of 8 conservation consultants at Villa La Pietra, which was Sir Harold Acton's Florence residence bequeathed to New York University in 1994. Working very closely with the superintendent's office in Florence, I've been overseeing the conservation interests of the sculpture inside the villa for the past 19 years. I'm here for a couple of weeks now to treat these pair of spectacular Morning Virgin and St. John, which once formed part of a large deposition group. You can see an example of a complete deposition group which survives in Volterra. There are also related examples of this Morning Virgin and St. John in Paris at the Musée de Cluny, which probably relate most closely to them. I want to talk a little bit at first about how the sculptures were made. The sculptures are in polychrome wood, which means that they have been painted and gilded. The first step in creating the sculptures is that the wood needs to be hollowed out. And this needs to be done of sculptures of a certain size of which these figures conform. Because if you don't do that, then you risk cracking or checking of the wood as the wood is drying out. So the medieval craftsmen knew that and knew how to avoid that situation. So the wood is hollowed out. However, at this early period in the 13th century, they still wanted to make the sculpture seem whole. So they closed the back or the hollow that they had created with 2 planks. And you can come and you can see that most clearly in the figure of St. John, which has lost his upper plank and only his lower plank remains. These planks were inserted through dowels, which you can also see terminated at the top of St. John's back. Once the sculptures were carved, actually there's another aspect of their construction which is actually quite curious and a bit of a mystery. The bottom sections, and I think you can see that, is where there is a cut here and here. See, there's a separate section for the bottom part of St. John and also for the Virgin, and also St. John's feet are separate pieces. What seems a little bit of a mystery as to why these bottom parts were made as separate pieces of wood. We don't have very many other examples from this early period which show that kind of construction. But my feeling is that there's no reason to suspect that it's not part of the original construction. I think in general one would have to come up with some compelling evidence to demonstrate that in point of fact it isn't. It could be a very simple reason, could be that they didn't have wood that was large enough to accommodate the size of the figures that they needed in this instance. Which brings me to a whole nother aspect of medieval craftsmanship, and that is, or the process of carving sculptures in the medieval period, is because we tend to think of medieval Europe as being very heavily forested and therefore wood available for sculptures to be readily available. And we know that that's simply not the case, that oftentimes it was very difficult to find an appropriate piece of wood of a certain size to create these images. So it's quite possible that they simply didn't have 2 pieces, and not only 2 pieces, but even many more, because remember it's part of a large deposition group that could accommodate the size that they required. Another aspect of the construction, which I've been waiting and I've been dying to show you, but I wanted you to get a sense of the technique of construction in general, is that not only are the lower parts of the sculpture separate pieces of wood, but the arms of both the Virgin and the St. John are carved separately and then attached, and I'm going to demonstrate now. Here's the arm, and here you see how it's been detached. Once the carving is complete of the sculpture, the wood is sealed, usually with animal glue, and oftentimes, and especially at this early period, textile is applied, and occasionally textile is applied over the entire sculpture. In this instance, it's not absolutely everywhere, but it seems to be fairly fairly broadly applied. in many areas, and you can actually see very clearly the textile, especially at the back of the Virgin, which is covering the join for the upper plank. However, even in the face of St. John, where the polychromy has been lost, you can see the textile even in his face. One very interesting aspect of the technique is that in the next step, which is the ground layer, which is the preparation for the polychromy, that a number of the details that are raised that we might associate or immediately think are in wood are actually in the ground layer, which has been raised to create the form. And this is especially true in the hair of St. John and even part of the fabric that goes towards his back. Once the ground layer has been applied, the next step is to gild, to do any kind of gilding that's required. The technique of the gilding at this early period of the 13th century is distinguished by the fact that the leaf, in this case it's silver leaf, it's not gold leaf, which is later much more common, that the silver leaf is applied directly to the ground layer. This is unlike our more commonly seen technique that occurs later in later centuries, where there's a bowl applied before the gilding is applied. This technique of applying in this case, the silver leaf directly to the ground layer has been recently termed, and I think it's a very appropriate term, it's called ground gilding, to distinguish it from this later water gilding technique that uses bowl. The silver leaf would have been originally glazed to prevent tarnishing. They knew in the Middle Ages that silver tarnished and tarnished rather rapidly. And so there would have been a glaze applied. The glaze is largely lost on both the St. John and the Virgin. But there, I did find a very tiny trace of a green glaze on St. John's mantle. So it's likely that his entire mantle had been similarly glazed. Other aspects of this early period of the 13th century polychromy is the linearity of the design. So for example, if you look at the eyes of the Virgin and St. John, they're almost a sense of an eyeliner, and this is very typical of this early moment. A very charming aspect of this linearity is seen in the hair of the Virgin and St. John, where you can actually see the strands of hair being depicted. And at the back of the neck of St. John, the hair even extends beyond his head and falls very gently onto the back of his neck. The Virgin is wearing what would be called a snood, or a kind of hairnet, and it's been very charmingly rendered in this white paint. Well, I think the reason I'm here, actually, is because the polychromy, which often happens, has been lifting. That is, as the polychromy has been separating from its substrate. And this often happens when there's been changes in relative humidity. I think the St. John is in worse condition than the Virgin, and I think that may be due to the fact that it was closer to the windows, it's closer to a heat source. And what happens is that the wood shrinks, because wood, as you know, being organic, it can expand and contract according to the atmosphere that it's in. But the paint layers and the ground layers are stable, and they can't move together with the wood. So what happens in often cases is that the polychromy starts to tend, and this needs to be set down and stabilized, which is what I have been doing since I've been here. The technique is to use a sturgeon glue, which is a fish glue, and which really brings back to the polychromy, or to the ground layers, a kind of glue that's very similar to the original glue that was used. Originally they were used an animal glue, not necessarily a fish glue, but they're compatible enough, and I think it's important that we maintain a compatibility in this instance. So do you have any questions for me about these sculptures?
So when you begin a new conservation project, what are the first questions you ask yourself for the beginning of your process?
It's a very good question. I think what you're wanting to do is to assess exactly the condition of the work of art, and stability would be foremost as a consideration, especially since you know that the works of art need to be moved from a location. These sculptures, as you know, are from the Sala del Pranza and stand on these casones. So one had to be certain at the outset that indeed they were safe enough to move, which fortunately was the case. And then once they're down, once they've been removed and they've been put into a more of a kind of studio setting, one can assess more clearly what the conservation issues are.
What kind of wood is typically used in polychrome structures such as these?
It depends on the region. In Italy, poplar is the most commonly used wood for the construction of polychrome sculpture, but other woods were used. Sometimes it comes as a surprise. For example, that linden wood, which is more commonly found in southern Germany, was actually also used in Italy, and in fact was very highly prized. And Alberti, in his 10 books on architecture, actually praises lindenwood for its tractableness. So the wood of these sculptures has not been analyzed, and that would be something to be a kind of further investigation.
I actually have another question pertaining to the textiles. I'm more familiar with painting on ancient wood, such as the fine portraits. So this use of textile, actually, could you clarify what it's actually doing and what its purpose is in the greater configuration of the statue?
Yes, no, that's an excellent question. The textile is applied to counteract irregularities in the wood. That the wood, oftentimes in this early period, is not as highly finished as in later periods where there would be a sense of a greater bareness of the wood or a greater exposure to the wood. So it definitely counteracts that. It's often applied to cover knots in the wood, other imperfections in the wood, and as I mentioned, it's used here to cover the joins of the panels at the back. This is also that you have a smoother surface for the application of the ground layer and the subsequent polychromy.
I have a question that's kind of more general, I guess, regarding the approach that you have. So these are part of the collection that's kind of quite important here in the villa. So can you talk a little bit about the philosophy that's behind the treatment of specifically these, but in general in the villa collection?
Yes. As I mentioned, I'm one of 8 consulting conservators at the villa, and the philosophy that we have for the conservation of the collections is not to restore the works of art as one might in a museum setting, but rather to stabilize the works of art, to maintain the appearance as we suspect it would have been for Harold Acton's father, Arthur Acton. We're very concerned about maintaining the atmosphere of the villa as an early 20th century phenomenon, and one's fearful of, let's say, cleaning too far or restoring too much, because once one does that, one might upset the balance which is inherent in the villa. And I hope you'll all come to the villa and see for yourself, and hope you agree how well it works.